It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host this morning. Appreciate you joining with us. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to understand the problems that we're facing. We're going to cover a number of different topics this morning. The show is broken into 4 segments. The first is going to be the U.S. default and the constitutional crisis that we have found ourselves in. I would suggest to you that at this point, we are looking at a constitutional crisis. We're looking at a government that believes, on the executive and Senate side, that the representatives who are blocking their move forward, that their ethic or beliefs or ideology and their desire to gain another blank check actually overrides the rights and the intentions and the direction of the House of Representatives, which is the closest to the people by its very definition, and the definition given to it by our founding fathers. That's disturbing, to say the least. It's also concerning in the sense that the House of Representatives is increasingly being made to have less and less say in what happens in government. And yet, again, it is the closest to the people. The Senate is not responsible or responsive to anyone, neither states nor individuals. So the electorate has no say, and frankly, the states no longer have a say in what the Senate does because of the 17th Amendment and their election by popular vote instead of appointment by legislation or legislators in state houses. Where we stand today is a Senate that, frankly, is responsible to no one. They now represent the government to the people versus the other way around. And as for the executive, it's hard to imagine that anyone believes that this is an executive office which is not completely and totally out of control. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm also going to give you a couple of famous quotes in our second segment that are representative of our situation today. And these are quotes from our founding fathers. And the reason I find them instructive, and I hope you will too, is because they are warnings to us, essentially. We should be heeding them as such. Our fourth and final segment is going to be the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and how that is currently being negotiated in secret by the president. The Senate and the House have not even had an opportunity to look at it. There's not even a draft that's been shown to them, and the president is moving for this basically to have an extended approval system that would dramatically shorten the period of time that the Senate would have an opportunity to look at this and limit their ability to have any input whatsoever in its content. Now, this proposal is, one, no one's actually seen it other than the players who are involved. And by the way, the players who are involved in many cases are corporations and their representatives who are acting as advisors in this capacity. But the problem here is that the president is moving forward with the idea that he could get this agreement passed through the Senate, which would normally have advisory or opportunity to review and dismiss this. But he is limiting their input to a up or down vote. In other words, there won't be any amendments allowed. And this agreement has guidelines that cover everything, folks, from food to financial markets, medical pricing, patents, copyright rules, internet freedom. I mean, this thing is so massive in its scope. It's everything that folks fear when they talk about the New World Order. The problem is that they're not divulging any information about this to the Senate or the House prior to the conclusion and the president signing. There's been no public access. All right. Well, I'm going to get into it in that last article because I don't want to go over the whole thing now. The first thing I do want to talk about here, however, is that where we stand now in this default issue is that the president and, quite frankly, the Senate have created a constitutional crisis. The crisis is based upon the fact that where we are right now, we're about to go into default, which would be, frankly, in my opinion, and I'm not a constitutional attorney, but I think plenty of others are who have looked at the issue. If the president refuses to back down and follow the will of the House, which, by the way, has the purse strings and is required to submit all spending issues and have supervisory and oversight on all spending, that if the president were to either allow the nation to go into default or attempt to utilize the 14th Amendment to try to raise the debt limit individually or unilaterally, that he would be in an impeachable position. And I would agree with that because anyone who looks at least intellectually honestly at the 14th Amendment would recognize that it states that the president has an obligation to make sure that that's paid, but not that he has the ability to utilize that clause to go out there and unilaterally raise the debt. Now, the power of the purse is an important role, and the reason that the power of the purse is given to the House versus the Senate is because the people, the individuals themselves, the electorate, the general public, are the ones who are going to ultimately have to pay for everything. Not the states necessarily, but the citizens themselves through their taxation. And this is long before the 16th Amendment, where the IRS was created and taxation and income tax was created. The problem is that what we have is a House of Representatives who are routinely being limited, if you will. They're being castrated. And the problem with that is that, this is being done by the House, by the Senate and the President directly. And this is, for all intents and purposes, ladies and gentlemen, the circumstances we find ourselves in as a nation, and I'm not just talking about the debt limit increase and the shutdown and the NSA and the IRS and so many other scandals, Benghazi. What we're seeing, TPP and the TTIP, what we're seeing is a slow motion coup. we are looking at the fundamental change that Barack Obama promised. We're looking at a fundamental change by a man who didn't grow up here, doesn't have the intrinsic and basic understanding of the mom apple pie and America the Great that those of us who were born here and grew up here have in our hearts. He's an outsider. And when I say he's an outsider, I mean in the sense that he grew up in Indonesia, at least for a significant portion of his life, and certainly in the influential portions of his life as a young child. He grew up with a mother who was clearly a leftist. He didn't have a whole lot of contact with his father early on in his life, but he certainly had a lot of influence on him. And his father was a Marxist, as was his mother. And certainly every mentor in his life as he grew up was also. And yet, of course, he claims to be mainstream moderate. Well, what he's done over the course of the past 5 years, I don't consider moderate in any way, shape, or form. And it is not his place to fundamentally change the system and the nature and the methodology of government. It's not his place to change what this nation has lived by for the past 235 years. There's a guy by the name of McClintock. He is a House member, and he's a Republican from California, which is kind of an oxymoron itself. And he has come out, and he's been on Levin's talk show, and he's been making some public statements about how the President Obama, by threatening the United States with default, is assuming the power of the purse that truly belongs to the House of Representatives. And that essentially a failure to raise the debt limit itself, in and of itself, would not cause the nation to go into default. Because we have enough income and enough revenue to pay the debt and to pay the interest on the debt. What we have is this massive federal deficit of, as it sits right now for the year, $785 billion. In other words, we've brought in a total of 2.7, and I don't want to get wonky with the numbers here, but we brought in a total of $2.7 trillion in tax revenue, and that's generated from income tax, payroll tax, and corporate taxes. But we spent $3.5 trillion as of right this moment, leaving us a deficit of $785 billion. The problem is that even with a $1.1 trillion renewal, if you will, or addition to the debt, we will not see that federal deficit go down. Because it's really not intended to cover that federal deficit. What they want that money for, because they want to continue to run a deficit, what they want that money for is to engage in new spending, which is unrelated to the existing spending that's already out there. The problem, of course, with that is that, the claims that he's making are that this is to pay the bills that we've already incurred. But I beg to differ, it's not. For starters, if we were to sit back and take the $785 billion deficit that we now have, and we were to cut out some of the most wasteful spending that we have, and we were to reform the entitlement programs of Social Security, the prescription drug, the Medicare liability, all of these unfunded liabilities that are out there, and we were to trim the excess spending that we do in regards to grants. And I'm talking about, literally, folks, we're talking about at least half a trillion dollars in grant money and money that is spent on things that are completely unrelated to government's role and function. Now, of course, they'll argue with that. They'll say, no, this is grant money that is going for medical research and all these other things. But the truth of the matter is, it's not really medical research. I mean, it's research, and it may be medical. But, the federal government's role is not to choose the winners and losers and to pick those areas where they want to have their tentacles, if you will. It's not their place to spend $2.5 million to study why lesbian women are heavier set than straight women. Now, you might call that medical research. I mean, in some convoluted rationale of some pencil neck on Capitol Hill, I suppose you could call that medical research. But it's really not. And it's certainly not worthy of a taxpayer expenditure. And I'm not saying that makes or breaks the difference here. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket. You know, $2.5 million is a drop in the bucket when we're talking about $785 billion. But when we are talking about, $500 million to Solyndra and the president right now has spent well over $150 billion on energy projects. That's part of the $785 billion. And the truth of the matter is that, if energy, well, first of all, we could reduce our energy right now. They keep playing on this false premise and the false promise that we'll be energy independent. For criminy's sake, we've been hearing that since the 70s, folks. And we are no closer now to energy independence than we were then. The truth is, if we want energy independence, we have to start drilling right here on our own ground. We have to build the XL pipeline. We have to start importing and then retaining the oil here domestically in the United States that we drill for instead of selling it overseas. We import $150 billion worth of oil from OPEC. But in addition to that, we import another $250 billion worth of oil from non-OPEC countries. With all due respect, the first way to cut our deficit is to stop importing oil from others and start utilizing what we have right here in our own yard, our own backyard. I mean, what farmer do you know, what household do you know that grows tomatoes in their home garden and then takes them to the farmer's market and sells them for, $1 a pound, and then goes to the supermarket and buys them again for $1.20 a pound from someone they don't know? I mean, explain that to me. There's no rationale, no logic, no reason that makes that an acceptable premise. Our trade deficit with China alone is $320 billion right now. Yet China is, despite all of the proclamations to the contrary, a sworn enemy of the United States of America, by their own admission. It's ridiculous. Our entire global trade deficit is only $690 trillion. 320 of that belongs to China. That means that we are losing $320 billion right now, just for this year alone, to China in uneven trade. Who's making that loss up? The problem that we have is that we have reached a constitutional crisis because America has come to the conclusion, slowly, that this debt is unsustainable. And I heard Goolsbee talking yesterday on a talk show, and he said, well, you can't look at these unfunded liabilities of $126 trillion and say that they're unfunded because it's not taking into effect or into account future tax revenues. But I've got to tell you, we're already soaked to the gills in taxes. There's not much more you can bleed from the stone. We're paying more taxes right now than we have ever before in the history of the United States of America. I'm sitting here looking at the U.S. debt clock. I encourage you to study this debt clock. Go to usdebtclock.org. Our federal tax revenue is $2.7 trillion as of right now. That's made up of $1.3 trillion in income taxes, $950 billion in payroll taxes, and $235 billion in corporate taxes. Isn't it interesting, by the way, that corporate taxes only account for $235 billion? And yet, the income tax of individuals is $1.3 trillion. I mean, corporations are paying less in taxes, 1/5 of the amount of just individuals. How is that? With a 30% tax rate, are you trying to tell me with a $16 trillion gross domestic product that corporations aren't paying more than $235 billion a year in taxes? How can that be? I'll tell you how it can be. The Congress has passed so many loopholes for all of their cronies and their capitalist pals who are essentially bribing their way into these reduced corporate tax rates. What we would be better off doing is just setting a level tax rate of 10% with no loopholes. That's it. Just pay. Pay your piece and move on. First of all, it would be one of the lowest tax rates in the world. So corporations would stop running overseas and hiding their money. Second, if there's no loopholes, everybody's on an even ground. But we have a $785 billion deficit, no matter how you classify it. Well, first of all, it's $785 billion, not $1.1 trillion, which is their current request for funding. So what are they going to do with the other $400 billion that's over and above the deficit? The simple truth is, we've reached an impasse where we can no longer ignore the consequence of this debt. And increasing it and losing all points of negotiation, all the strength in a negotiation, is why the House is balking. That's why the House is fighting. That's why the House says no more. And with all due respect, those people who are standing firm on their ground and saying we've had enough are doing so because that's what their constituents have asked them to do. Their positioning is no less important, no less valuable than that of the executive and the Senate. In fact, it's even more valuable because the House is elected every 2 years. It's fresher, it's newer, it's more current, and it's more direct. We will not go into default because we failed to raise the debt ceiling. That's a misnomer that the press and the media and the administration are fostering on you. It does mean we're going to have to make some very dramatic cuts. There's no denying it. We've got a $785 billion hole to fill. But I dare say that hole can be filled. Because the one thing that America has always stood upon, that has given us strength and capabilities, the one area where Americans have been different in many cases from many other nations around the world is that where there's a will, there's a way. The problem is there's no will. There's a will from the people, but there's not a will from the people who are allegedly representing us. And therein, ladies and gentlemen, lies the thing in a nutshell. That is the problem. And that's why you hear me say they no longer represent the American people in Congress. The revenues that we have are more than ample to pay off our debt. It will require that we make draconian and dramatic cuts in what we spend. But frankly, I want to say for the record, I am willing to go there. I am willing to go there. I am willing to say we need to means test everyone who is on Medicare. If you are a multimillionaire, you shouldn't be getting subsidized. I'm not saying you didn't put that money in and you're not allowed to take it back out. I am saying that if you have millions of dollars in the bank, that you are not entitled to take out more than you put in. It's that simple. I am saying that this crazy spending where we give away money left and right to foreign governments, to these ridiculous studies, to subsidizing all kinds of research and endless studies of everything from how fish swim to how spoons make you fat is absolutely wasteful spending. And government has no business doing that. It's not their place. I'm saying that the couple of $100 billion we have spent just this year alone on terrorizing and oppressing and literally terrorizing the American people with the NSA and the IRS, that is money that is completely salvageable. Reform the IRS with one fell swoop. Simply provide a flat tax that everyone pays. End of argument. And it doesn't matter whether you make $1 or $1 million or $1 billion. You pay your share. And then you no longer need an IRS. There's a couple of $100 billion right there. The Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education, clearly one of the most failed organizations and administrative agencies in the history of humanity, is $100 billion a year. Eliminate it. We just found out that 93% of the EPA is completely unnecessary. Scale it back by 93%. I want clean water. I want clean air too. I don't want American citizens being terrorized by the EPA because they want to build a piece of property, build a home on a piece of property they own. Because some nature conservancy organization has got their ear. And that's what we're experiencing, folks. That's the true crime of what we have going on. All right, we've got to take a break. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to continue on this topic, and then I'm going to deal with some famous founder quotes that are representative of our situation as we currently find ourselves. Stick with us. You're listening to America's Voice Now. You can find us on the web by going to americasvoicenow.org. You can find us at our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/America's Voice Now. And then you can find our YouTube channel on YouTube at youtube.com/America's Voice Now. We try to post every show that we do up on our website and our latest news links. So if you just want to catch today's shows, you start going to americasvoicenow.org, and you'll literally just scroll down and you'll be able to see the shows that were from that day. Posted up there every day. We're going to be making some changes to the website. I'll bring you up to speed as we move forward. We're looking at a brand new interface and a whole new user experience on the website. I think you'll find it valuable and easier to manage. And we'll be back in just a moment. Stick with us. And when we return, we'll take on the remainder of this section here.